Hello and welcome to The Digital Insight, the technology, procurement and supply chain podcast that delivers valuable C-level perspective into the core issues surrounding business transformation and digital disruption. Each episode will bring you the most inspiring executive insights from those who are leading transformation strategies within the world's biggest and best-known companies. The Digital Insight. Disrupt, transform, evolve.
Welcome to The Digital Insight, the official podcast series for CPO strategy and interface magazines. How prepared is the retail sector to fully embrace a digital supply chain? Answering that question for us today is Wayne Snyder, Vice President, Retail Industry Strategy for EMEA at Blue Yonder, together with Jan Godzill, Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Strategy at the University of Warwick. In this episode, we look at the Retail Supply Chain Digital Readiness Report released earlier this year as part of a collaboration between Blue Yonder and the University of Warwick. So hey guys, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
No, excellent. And I'm always intrigued to find a little bit more about our guests before we sort of dive into our main topic of discussion. So I think it would be great for our listeners and of course for me, if you could kind of, give us a bit of an idea, a brief overview as to who you are and what your career journeys are and effectively what your understanding and experiences are within the procurement and supply chain space. So I suppose, Wayne, if you want to go first.
Sure, no problem at all. So my name is Wayne Snyder. So I'm currently the Vice President of Retail Strategy across EMEA for Blue Yonder, which is a leading digital supply chain organisation focused in the retail and manufacturing space. So my background is for really 25 years in retail, working for a number of different retailers, helping them kind of really advance their strategies and their supply chain processes and support them in their business transformation. And I joined Blue Yonder about 2 years ago, as I say, in this industry strategy role, which is really to try to make sure that what we're doing within the organisation is not just technology for technology's sake, but it's aligned to really meeting the needs of our retail and manufacturing customers.
Sorry, and I'm Jan Godzill. So I'm currently a Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Strategy at WMG, the University of Warwick. So I started my career actually as an engineer. I was sponsored from school by ICI, so that shows my age. And actually within ICI, I started really as an engineer. And very quickly, though, I realised that I wanted to use my engineering skills within a manufacturing context. As at that time, I was really fascinated by the excellence of Japanese manufacturing and Japanese manufacturing techniques. I was very, very fortunate to be able to spend some time over there. But actually, it was my personal life, marriage, that brought me to the Southwest. And at the time, I responded to an advert in the paper to work for a small scale-up organisation called Dyson. And that was a very exciting time because it was the time when Dyson was moving from having about 400 employees to about 2,000. And it was at Dyson that I realised that no matter how good we made manufacturing, it wasn't necessarily going to help Dyson as an organisation grow. They were going through exponential growth. And what we needed to make sure was that every vacuum cleaner we produced ended up as a sale actually with a consumer that wanted it and not stuck in a warehouse somewhere, but that equally we could help to increase the capacity both of our own manufacturing facility and our supply base to support being able to produce more and keeping more customers happy. And so it was really at Dyson that I realised that it's not just about manufacturing, it's actually about a much broader range of processes, about planning, about procurement, about manufacturing and logistics, and how they actually come together to balance demand and supply and bring supply chains to life.
No, it sounds fantastic. And between you, the two of you, then you have some really great and some incredible experience. And something you just said then, Janet, about sort of it was at that time that you start to understand the kind of sum up the complexities, the sort of key value that comes from a procurement function. This is something that we've spoken about on this podcast before, and I write about it a lot. Is that in recent years, not to put a number on it, but let's just say the last five or 6 years, and perhaps even beyond that, a number of organisations the world over have started, and regardless of industry, have started to reinvest in supply chain and procurement because something had happened one day, or I don't know whether it was a spark, but something had happened where people had started to recognise, actually, there's more to be said, and there's more to be done, and there's more to be achieved with procurement and supply chain than simply getting stuff at a good cost, and handling suppliers. looking over the last your careers, then how have you sort of seen the supply chain and procurement conversation change? How have you seen, to use a buzz phrase that everyone seems to say, procurement suddenly get this seat at the table to be recognised as a very strategic arm of a business rather than just an add-on function?
So I would say that, and I think kind of a report that we did has highlighted this, that there's definitely been a change over the last few years that organisations are looking to be much more connected than they were in the past. So it's still true that many organisations still don't feel that they are connected in the way they want to be going forward, and they see technology as a key enabler of that. But I think that's been a significant change, that people are no longer looking at supply chain just as maybe the end of the process, but understanding that actually these things need to be connected throughout, and you need to kind of make sure the start of the process is aligned to the end. So I think that's been a kind of a significant shift. I think also there's been consumer-driven trends that have changed a lot of these different things. So if I speak from a retail perspective, which is my kind of area of expertise, it's really about kind of transformed particularly in the last 20 years or so. Obviously, the internet was a huge catalyst to this, and it's changed absolutely how people have to fulfill stock. It's also transformed how people are having to procure stock. So in the fashion world, for example, there's a much more a demand for newness in a way that wasn't there, that really has affected how the supply chain needs to be much more flexible and speedy. In the grocery world, there's an expectation that products are available at all seasons. So again, that's challenged people and looking their procurement from a much more of a global perspective. So I think that there's been kind of a lot of consumer trends that have driven these different things that have forced companies to really invest a lot more in it. But as I say, I think that most retailers are recognizing that they're still far from where they need to be, and are kind of looking really at the next few years to be the real catalyst to make those changes. And I think obviously, COVID has obviously accelerated those different things. And I think it's certainly shone a light in a lot of organizations to the weaknesses that maybe in the past they're able to paper over, but it's shown that those cracks really can't be papered over anymore, and they're going to have to really address them in a much more strategic way.
So will approach this from a slightly different perspective. So I think of all of the core supply chain processes. So in supply chain, we have the SCORE model, the supply chain operations reference model, and this idea that a supply chain is made up of 5 core processes: planning, procurement, manufacturing, logistics, and what's becoming increasingly important, the return process. When I segued from industry into academia around 2001, there was about 9% of organisations that had a supply chain director. But more often than not, they were essentially a rebranded either procurement director or logistics director, because actually they were the two functions that were seen to be associated with the supply chain. And I would say over the last 20 years or so, we've seen perhaps maybe a lack of understanding about the difference between procurement and end-to-end supply chain management, and the differences that they play. So they're both important strategically, but they do different things for an organisation. And particularly in the retail sector, we have perhaps seen some quite exploitative procurement practices, as procurement has been seen as the part of an organisation that could essentially facilitate cost down. And quite often that cost down has been facilitated through procurement practices that have taken cost out of the supply base, sometimes because that's a genuine cost down, sometimes because that's been more achieved through, I would say, some slightly more hard-arm tactics with suppliers. And so we've perhaps seen a combination of both good procurement practices and some less favourable procurement practices. Perhaps what we've seen over the last 5 years, though, is this shift in understanding that procurement, whilst it plays an extremely important part within the supply chain, it is but one of those 5 processes. And that the most successful supply chains are perhaps run more with a view, so this links to Wayne's comment about connectivity, they are supply chains that we can coordinate and manage end to end. So over the last 5 years, where we've had better availability of data, and we've also had access to cheaper analytics tools that enable us to make better decisions with those data, perhaps our focus has shifted from one of looking at the supply chain just to do cost down. which has perhaps been largely procurement driven, to one where we can actually look at how we can make more intelligent end-to-end decisions so that we can deliver customer value at lowest end-to-end supply chain cost, and actually start to look at things like carbon footprint or responsibility and fairness across that supply chain too. And really, perhaps the process that brings that to life is planning, and this view that we need to actually manage and coordinate our supply chains. And in order to do that, we need to have the visibility. And organisationally, that's perhaps seen the advent of the Chief Supply Chain Officer. So a role that perhaps augments or supports the Chief Procurement Officer to perhaps take that broader perspective.
Can I add to that? I think that's a great point. I think, as you say, I think technology is going to be a huge enabler. I think there's I'd still sense from my personal experience and some customers that we do that actually that connectivity is really not so straightforward. And I think one of the challenges retailers still have, and I think it's probably true within the manufacturing sector as well, is that across the organisation you can have those competing KPIs that Jan mentioned, in terms of, one department may be much more focused on cost, another may be on sales, another on margin. And until organisations make sure that they're in sync across all these different metrics, it's going to make some of these things inevitably more kind of disjointed.
So Wayne, you obviously referenced it then a few moments ago, and you talked about technology, but one of the main reasons we're sort of speaking today is that earlier this year, together, obviously Blue Yonder and the University of Warwick released the Retail Supply Chain Digital Readiness Report. And I kind of want to, obviously I'm not going to go through a deep dive into every single part of that report, but we kind of want to look at some of the key takeaways. But before we even do that, I guess, can you kind of introduce the report in terms of basically why now? Why was this report sort of done this year? What kind of was the sort of the goal of the report, and who really, or do you want people to sort of to be looking at the report and to be taking the key information away from it?
So actually, this report, the retail report, is actually a follow-on from a successful initiative that was done last year in the manufacturing sector, where we asked kind of a series of manufacturing kind of companies around the globe similar questions, looking at the digitalization of their supply chain. So we wanted to kind of really work on the back of the success from a retail perspective. I think that in some respects we were fortunate that actually this was taking place, kind of the early stages were taking place during the kind of the early days of COVID, which actually maybe played a different kind of lens on some of the answers for people. And we also actually augmented this with some specific COVID research. But I think that really the aim of it is to allow companies themselves to really self-evaluate where they are. We didn't want to come in and say, this is us saying what is best practice. What we're saying is actually here are examples of different levels of kind of maturity along the supply, kind of different parts of the supply chain. So we allow companies really to look at themselves and evaluate themselves, really how mature they are, going from really what I would say very rudimentary level 1 processes, maybe utilizing tools like Excel, very manual processes, to a level 4, which would be much more about machine learning, AI, kind of autonomous supply chain. And really, by allowing people to self-mark, it really kind of took us out of in terms of kind of people feeling like they were being judged. They were able to judge themselves and judge not only what they wanted to do themselves, but we'll also be able to compare it against their peers in the industry to see how they were, and also actually be able to look at what their aspirations are. So actually, whether they're able to see where they thought it was important is also important compared to what their industries and the peer are thinking as well. So, for example, you might find that one organisation is highly valuing areas such as strategic planning, but actually that may be on the whole less important to other organisations. So it was also a way of helping people understand actually what do they see the priorities, not just amongst themselves, but actually across the industry as a whole. And just to add for anybody that's listening, it's a free benchmarking that's available for anybody to go to. We can give details later on of the URL. So it's a fantastic initiative that we're really proud that we're working with Jan and the University of Warwick on.
And just to sort of say, and with obviously that kind of benchmarking and obviously even the title of the report about that sort of the Retail Supply Chain Digital Readiness Report, I talk to a lot of people who like to kind of expand on and and pat themselves on the back in places and champion, yep, we're looking at technology, we're looking at sort of completely digitizing our organization in this regard, and we're looking at implementing analytics here and using this technology there. But sometimes I get the feeling that perhaps the appetite doesn't quite match up with, like, say, the readiness. And I suppose, silly question because the answer is a lot, but how important is it for companies to sort of take a moment and to look at the reality of the situation? That because for some, when it comes to technology, they might just be looking at it because competitors are looking at it, but actually they shouldn't be looking at it because they don't have the capabilities in place. So what I'm saying, I guess, is how important is that benchmarking, particularly when it comes to something like digital processes and digital operations?
Many organisations try to potentially benchmark themselves against other firms. But one of the things about supply chains, particularly in a retail context, is that no two supply chains are the same. And so benchmarking can actually be really, really dangerous because you're not comparing apples with apples. And so actually maturity assessment tools, or tools that enable you to assess your current state of readiness and where you want to be, are potentially much more beneficial because they start a conversation. So they provide, perhaps it's a slightly qualitative evidence base, but they start an evidence base for a management team to get around to discuss what's your current state of readiness. And they can debate that and come to an agreement. But equally, it then helps them to identify where is the most valid area for improvement, or to improve the ambition for that organisation. Because particularly in this case, we looked at 9 core retail processes. It's probably impossible to focus on all 9 of those processes at the same time. And actually, it's perhaps not necessary either, because some of them won't be relevant to your business. Some of them may already be at a suitable level of maturity, and others are exactly where the company needs to focus their efforts if they want to maintain or create new sources of competitive advantage. So for me personally, it's less about external benchmarking. People quite like to be able to do that just to know where they're at. But the critical value of this tool is to start a conversation within that organisation and to help them map out their strategic plan for digitising their business in a value-adding way that's going to add value to their bottom line over the next 5 years.
Yeah. And sort of following on from that, obviously one of the things I've sort of picked out from the report is this notion of the 4 stages of an autonomous supply chain. And you talked about sort of then like kind of having those conversations and identifying where the strategic value add is of certain digital process and digital tools. Autonomous supply chain, automation, machine learning, that's the sort of thing that I'll get people say to me. I'll receive an email saying, do you want to talk about how this company is looking at automating its supply chain processes in this way? And it sort of gets to a point where even I sometimes think, well, surely some people are going to start getting overwhelmed because there's just so much out there. There's just so much talk about what automation means and why you should be doing it and what an autonomous supply chain should look like. And kind of going back to what you said earlier about how no two sort of supply chains are going to be the same. So what autonomous supply chain might mean to one business is going to mean something different to another in some regard. Can you sort of expand on that a little bit and tell me a little bit about how you're seeing that? How are you sort of seeing the autonomous supply chain conversation unfolding, in the industries that you're looking at?
Sure. I'll take this one. So you're absolutely right. It definitely differs by kind of different companies in terms of their aspirations. You're right, and I think the reality is that there are words like automation, artificial intelligence, and all these different things. I think to some extent there's a fatigue around because people have talked about these things for so long, and in many respects have not really been able to advance where they want to be, as this report has really highlighted. That what the report is highlighting, only 15% of global retail supply chains are what we would call digitally ready to meet the challenges of the next 5 years. So I think that really, it means different things to different people. But I think what we definitely are seeing as technology's enabler is it's really able to kind of be that connection. It doesn't mean that, for me, an autonomous supply chain doesn't mean there aren't human beings as part of it. Human beings are absolutely going to be a critical part of setting business strategy, of monitoring, of kind of providing insights. But ultimately, what you can then do is actually automate these things to really analyze and improve speed and flexibility. So, for example, if we looked at against some of our research in terms of the challenges people have had in recent times, and we're seeing it also, even more so now as this move to home working, kind of the importance of kind of collaboration and technology to support these things is going to get even more important. And with kind of the distinction for me, when I kind of compare it to, going back to your question before, how things have changed over the last 20 years or so, is that in reality, in many cases, the answer is it hasn't. And I think that's part of the problem. But actually, the world around us has changed a lot in those 20 years. But many companies are still utilizing many of the processes that they were using 20 years ago, give or take. And they really haven't kept up. So when we look at these things about autonomous technologies and machine learning and artificial intelligence, what they're able to do is really augment that human and understand things that we really, as a human being, aren't capable of doing. And that doesn't mean, I say, we don't play a role. But actually, the ability for a machine to be able to bring in literally millions of different data points from what's happening across different stores, across different products, across different days, across different hours, and to be able to analyze these things kind of in near real time, to be able to then spit out and make decisions and recommendations, and then start to learn the kind of the consequence of those actions, to be able to automate those decisions, to make sure that actually when things are happening, you can respond much quicker. Are just things that we're not geared to do as humans. We're geared up to do lots of different things. But actually, what we saw again during recent times is the ability for machines to be able to learn and understand and respond is just faster than what we're built to do. And in this current world where flexibility is going to be key and responsiveness is going to be key, then it's going to become even more important. So I think for me, the question for organizations is to really think to themselves, what are the important things that they want to automate? Because you can't do everything straight away, and not everything is business imperative for your organization. But actually, every organization very quickly needs to take the step. And I often joke when we do surveys about kind of where people are and what they aspire to be. Often, kind of these results don't change nearly as dramatically as you would expect year on year, because actually people's aspirations are always met with the reality, because things get in the way. But actually, the time has really come now where actually you have to make sure these things are a priority. And I think we're definitely seeing, particularly over the last few months, this kind of importance. And as we mentioned before, kind of the advent of the kind of the chief supply chain officer, where there really is somebody now that is absolutely now accountable for that digitization of the supply chain. It means that companies really can't wait, because the reality is if you wait, your competitors aren't. And you really need to make sure that you keep up with these things, or else you're not going to survive in this new digital world.
So I perhaps would agree, but perhaps would have I think there's going to be a transition period where there's more of a balance. So one of the things that we've also identified to support companies on their journey is 4 different strategies to help them to digitize. And digitization doesn't always mean automation. And sometimes within those processes, so for instance, one of the things that our survey showed was that planning systems were really pretty effective for dealing with especially the initial response to COVID. And then as we were over that sort of initial spike of panic buying as things began to settle down. And we had a very high percentage of organisations. I think in actual fact, it was something like 53% of organisations who said that their planning systems were either extremely or very effective in dealing with the pandemic. However, we also had an incredibly high number of organisations, again, it was around 58%, who said that they'd required human intervention. And that was because that original peak, organisations and even their IT systems would not have seen that type of peak over the last 10 years. And so the system wouldn't have anything to learn from. Now that we've seen that type of behaviour, the system can learn. But the first time it happens, it probably does require a human to be able to intervene. Otherwise, many of the automated systems would go off and perhaps try to replenish something that was a one-off demand rather than a continuous demand signal. So I think during this transition period, we need to be mindful of that sort of human digital balance, and also therefore that actually we still require, there's still a lot of value in our organisation of those people that have that skill and know how things work, as well as appreciating how the systems work too, and it's how the two come together.
And with kind of that, I think you're absolutely right, sort of that striking that balance, that understanding. But I still think sometimes that, and again, I'm not the expert, so I might be reading this completely wrong. But when I speak to certain people and I talk to them about what's happening in the kind of supply chain and the procurement space, I'm sometimes taken aback a little bit, because I think, well, surely the conversation, the digital conversation, the autonomous conversation should be further along than what it currently is. For example, looking at the report, you sort of, it indicates that majority of retailers are at an early stage of adoption of sort of the autonomous supply chain, with only 15% of them having reached a level 3 or above. And I sometimes think, well, why is it not higher than that? What's kind of the biggest hurdle preventing that sort of figure from being somewhere much higher than that? What do you think that would be?
So I do have quite a strong opinion on this. And actually, it's not linked to digital technology. It's actually linked to the understanding of supply chain itself. So we can use digital technologies to help us make a single process better. So that would be whether it be strategic planning, whether that be connected retail, network design. And historically, that's how we've used technology. And usually it would have been a functional manager that brings someone in to help them improve a particular retail process. However, if we truly want to compete, delivering customer value at lowest possible supply chain cost in a responsible way, we need to connect those together end to end. And that actually requires our business to take a business process view of supply chain. Now, organisations have done it for new product development. They've also done it for customer relationship management. But we haven't. There are very, very few organisations. In fact, a previous study we did in 2016 would suggest it's only about 17% of organisations that actually view supply chain as an end-to-end business process. And unless you do that and then have the right metrics to support it, which probably mean you have to have a third of your metrics that are supporting that end-to-end supply chain, and that means they're unlikely to be smart, i.e. they're not specific, measurable, achievable, realistic or timely, because they're shared across the entire supply chain. But that's supported by functional targets, which would be around a specific process that could be very smart, and also business-facing metrics. And so I think part of the solution is actually it's around creating that end-to-end view of supply chain management as a process, which is essentially the critical difference between level 2 and level 3 maturity, and then making sure that you've got the right organisational design and performance measurement and governance system in place to support it.
So looking elsewhere at the report then, so again, I'm just sort of going to pick a few sort of key figures that I kind of identified as something that I'm intrigued to explore a little further. One of the things that, particularly with what's happening right now, seemed to sort of leap out at me a little bit, where it says that retailers, or the respondents at least, are not able to react to changes in demand in real time. And that only 8% are sort of refreshing demand planning processes on a real time basis. Now, given demand and sort of fluctuating demands and kind of all kinds of issues that we've experienced in these last, sort of 8 months now, surely that's incredibly low. Surely it shouldn't have took something like COVID to kind of shine a spotlight on that figure being ridiculously low. I don't want to sort of turn around and say, well, why are we failing? Why is this a big bad thing? But, what does that say about where we are, where supply chains are in the retail industry, and where they've still got to go? That figure is as low as 8%.
So I'd say that I think the way that retailers have coped with these things is that they built flex in across the supply chain. So if your demand forecast accuracy isn't strong, you hold excess inventory as a result to try to cover for the inaccuracies in it. So I think that a lot of retail kind of processes have overcome some of those weaknesses in the what they've been able to do. And I think that I think to some extent kind of building on what was just said before about kind of the changes, it's change isn't easy. Change takes effort, and it can be costly, and it can be risky. And as a result, though, I think that sometimes you do need that catalyst, and maybe the recent times has been that catalyst to really help people. And I think also at the end of the day, and I say this working for a technology company, to some extent, kind of technology until recently has not helped. And it's only in recent times with advances we've seen with kind of, machine learning and automation and cloud computing and all these different things that are really able kind of at a much lower cost and a much higher speed to value, really kind of help people in a way that probably they weren't able to do in the past. So, there's a combination of lots of factors happening at the moment that really make the time right for people.
And sort of following on from that as well, then talk about that catalyst. Another sort of key figure, or necessarily the key figure, but there's a sort of a key metric in there that talks about how almost 3/4 of retailers are wanting to switch to prescriptive autonomous technology, which incorporates machine learning within the next 5 years. Now, we've talked about sort of why perhaps we're not further along that conversation as we'd expect we are. But what I'm curious about that is sort of saying, well, 5 years is quite a long time. And as we know, given how much has changed in only recent years, how mindful must companies be and people be within supply chain that they're perhaps reaching a goal, aiming for a goal, let's say like within that 5 years, we want X, to achieve X, Y, Z, that by the time they get there, I don't want to say that that's now an obsolete mindset, but the playing field has changed even further by the time they sort of get even halfway to as they originally were setting out to go. How much should they consider that in their sort of long-term goals, that things can change at any given time, and the technology that they're looking to implement actually might not be what they need by the time they get to where they thought they should have been.
You're right. And you're absolutely right in saying that maybe in 5 years' time, when we sit here talking, what we thought would be leading practice in 5 years time is very different. But I think the reality is that nobody can do everything overnight, and you have to understand what are your business priorities. And I think you also need to build flexibility in terms of what you're doing. So, as I said before, I think, by understanding what are your true business priorities, then you really can set yourselves on down the road. What I think we would suggest to people, though, is that as they're developing these things, it's continual and it's iterative. Having worked in a lot of kind of projects prior to joining Blue Yonder, I always would advise clients at the time that the worst approach is when you view a project very much as a finite kind of implementation. It's never finite. It's never done. And you have to really make these things much more continual and dynamic and continually evaluate what are the right ways to go. And I think, again, it's not all about technology at all. But I think one of the advances in technology recently is a big focus on these microservices, where you don't have to really tackle everything in one big go. You can incrementally improve and adapt and adopt different kind of tactics as you're going along. But I think also, I also kind of want to build on what was just said before about kind of the balance between manual and automation. We see, for example, today from our research that the vast majority of organizations don't run automated warehouses. Now, you can sit back here and say, well, that is in today's days and age of cost reduction and speed, that's a terrible thing to do. And we've got some phenomenal examples of automated warehouses in the marketplace. However, we also saw in recent times that actually fully automated warehouses struggled in a way that other organizations didn't, to actually scale up to these huge increases of demand. Because in the way that kind of maybe supermarkets were able to throw bodies at picking and collecting and all these different things, you couldn't throw robots at it. You couldn't throw extra warehouses at it. So it is getting that right balance and making sure that actually you've got a 5-year plan, but also you are recognizing you need to build flexibility into that and make it much more continuous in the way you're developing it.
Yeah, so just to build on that, then I think what Wayne has just identified is a really, really good example of a buffer. So what we're actually talking about here is supply chain resilience. And I think perhaps what's been forgotten about as organisations have perhaps seek to really hone their costs, and with many organisations having to make returns to their investors and being seen to have good return on capital employed, what that forces is all of the buffer to be taken out of the system. And those buffers could be spare manufacturing capacity, they could be spare warehouse capacity, they could be inventory. Now, one of the best warehouses that I know, so if you were to look at the way, for instance, that John Lewis managed Magna Park, that is a highly automated warehouse, but they will only ever automate the base demand. So they know that they would never try to automate their peak for Christmas because it doesn't make cost-effective sense to automate a peak that's only going to occur for a small number of weeks within the year. But equally, they keep a very large space available into that warehouse for which they have very well honed manual processes to be able to respond. That same process could happen with inventory, or it could happen with manufacturing capacity. And actually, one of the slightly scary results of the survey was that actually what we saw was that 61% of organisations are actually using inventory as their primary buffer, and only 29% were using agile production systems. Now, that was absolutely fine if you were in food or that type of retail where actually, generally speaking, there was an upturn in demand. But actually, if you were in fashion, clothing, some aspects of general retailing, where demand for your products fell away overnight, you were then suddenly left with large stockpiles of inventory for whom there was no market. And so I'd actually say going forward, organisations need to be much more mindful about supply chain resilience, appreciate that it has a cost, and actually think across the end-to-end supply chain, where is the best place to have that buffer, and what is the most appropriate and most flexible format to keep it in.
No, absolutely. And throughout this conversation already, we've touched upon it in kind of passing, but we haven't outright said about, with the COVID-19 pandemic and the true impact of what we have obviously in parts, but we haven't necessarily said, well, this is what's happening and why and how. But one thing that I'm really enjoying speaking to a lot of people about, at the moment is, Wayne described it as potentially a catalyst. Whereas some other people will have turned around and said it's been devastating beyond the obvious reasons because it's kind of held procurement back, or it's forced companies and sort of leadership teams to say, look, all right, it's been great for these last few years that we've been focusing on investing in cool technology and that sort of thing. Actually, now with what's happening, we're going to have to hit the brakes on that and sort of focus again on surviving and thriving as a business. What are your thoughts in terms of just how has COVID affected the conversation around supply chain in terms of, has it propelled it forward? Has it shone a spotlight on it? Or has it forced people to say, I'm sorry, we kind of have to go back to that kind of old mindset of what supply chain can be?
So from my perspective, I've never been busier, whether that be at a UK government level, whether that be at an industry sector level, or whether that be at an individual firm level, because I think what this has done is shine a spotlight on supply chain and just show how important it is to the long-term future viability of individual firms, but also the supply chains that they reside in. I think that it's both a challenge and opportunity, which is whilst supply chain has this focus, is to make sure that we take all of the opportunities we can to harness the potential to propel our supply chains to their next level of maturity before the focus goes somewhere else.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I think that it's definitely, it's absolutely highlighted to everybody the importance of supply chain. I mean, you're absolutely correct that we're cognizant that it's happening at a time where there's economic challenges and companies aren't always able to invest in the way that they were looking to do. But actually, they're a lot more forensic in the way they're looking to do it. They're looking for actually, say, much faster return on investment in terms of where they're going to do it. In some respects, they're much more focused in terms of what they want to do. And actually, that focus has turned itself onto the supply chain. So, I think that, for what we're seeing is actually the supply chain has definitely gone up a notch. And, it's at a time where investment may be challenged. But actually, there's a recognition that if people don't solve these problems, then actually they're not going to solve their own problems.
And one thing as well that's come up a lot is it's forced a lot of people to reflect on how operations have been up to a certain point and where they perhaps thought things were great. Actually, it's exposed some gaps, for example. And obviously, naturally, it's really important to kind of champion where things have gone well. Where throughout this difficult period, this is how we've managed to deal with it in a way that's enabled greater business continuity. But for me, I've found recently that a lot of people are finding it increasingly important to actually talk about where things haven't gone to plan, where I don't want to say the word mistakes, but missteps have been made. What are your thoughts on that? How important is it to, yes, champion success, but also recognize collaboratively, throughout the ecosystem where things have gone wrong?
So I would say that you're right. There has been, if I step back and look at actually how industry has coped with the last 6 months, I take my hat off to them. There's been phenomenal innovation. There's been a much more an entrepreneurial spirit. Companies have done things in the space of weeks that actually maybe in the past it have taken them years to do in their normal approach. So, the way some organisations have pivoted, changed production, changed their supply chain, in a very quick way, is absolutely admirable. But at the same time, as you say, it's it definitely it has shown what they haven't been able to do well. So I think you can also look at the examples of who did it well to show what people didn't do well. So if you look at some of the more, for example, nimble fashion organisations who are able to very quickly change production away from maybe some formal wear into casual wear, they've done well. Others that had more longer lead times, more older processes, maybe even more of a global supply chain rather than a mixed supply chain, were unable to respond in that same way. We saw it in terms of kind of from a manufacturing perspective, certain items being able to be kind of respond very quickly to the challenges. So we all know the shortages that happened with hand gels at the start, but very quickly production was upskilled. But different factories were turned over and changed the production to be focused on these different items. So I think there's definitely been winners and losers throughout this, and I think for me, I think that when you focus on the winners, it highlights what they did well, which was really kind of they did have that entrepreneurial spirit. They were agile, they were responsive, they were forward thinking, they were much more connected as an organisation. So it's been hard for everybody. The reality is that nobody could predict this, and no technology, no process can really cope with a shock of demand being doubled or stores being closed. But at the same time, I think that you can definitely see the people that dealt with it better, and there is a commonality between those that dealt with it better and those that haven't. And I think there's some of the lessons that can be learned from this.
So I think there's a real opportunity to actually understand, perhaps a bit more forensically, from those examples of leading practice where people were really able to flex their supply chain successfully. And maybe this is the type of thing that actually sectors could do. So retail could do more holistically, but even learn from other sectors too. And in a way, I think what we need to do, because the next thing that hits us won't be COVID. It could be a natural disaster. Who knows what it is? Let's hope it doesn't happen for a while, but something will hit us again. What we need to ensure at the end of the day, there are some items that retail provides that are critical to life. I think people were concerned in the early days about toilet roll, but actually more fundamentally really about food and some of the basic items we need. From a UK perspective, I don't think we ever came close to running out of any of those items, which is all credit to our supply chains. And what we need to learn is, what enabled them to flex in that way. And it's not just about what's the lessons learned. It's more about how did they actually develop their operating models in the way that enabled them to flex. But then equally for some of the products that Wayne's talking about, where actually demand for them was so beyond the norm that actually it required the creation of new supply chains, new networks. How do we actually make sure that within our supply chain network, both within the UK and globally, we have the right capabilities in place that we can reconfigure new supply chains in response to demand for things that we may never know that we need, or as Wayne also identified, actually switch demand off. And that brings me back, I suppose, just to that point, inventory as a buffer, or agile manufacturing capacity, or your agile supply chain as a buffer. Inventory's fine, but you always could catch a cold. It was those people perhaps were in a sector where demand was switched off, that had inventory buffers that were particularly badly hit. If they'd perhaps been using an agile manufacturing network as a buffer, they'd have been in a much more less exposed position.
And I think going back to the start of our conversation, actually, I think that kind of the point that Jan mentioned there, using some examples, say in the grocery sector, actually is where that connectivity kind of really came in. So if you look at how some of them coped, a lot of them kind of in those early days where demand was spiking and the supply was a challenge, is they looked at their assortment and they constrained it. and they looked at what were the mission critical items, and they focused their attention on it. So they changed their space, they changed their assortment, they reconfigured the warehouse, they looked at their staffing, and they were able, by actually working in a much more connected way, actually kind of focus their attention and make sure that we avoided those problems that people were fearing. And I think it was a great example of that kind of collaboration across the piece. Now, it took a bit of time. Maybe, when they look back, they'll look at actually ways they could do it better. But actually, it absolutely showed the kind of the advantages that we've been talking about from the start of actually, you can't just look at supply chain merely as the warehouse or logistics. It's absolutely from start to end.
And I suppose one thing that we kind of always knew, but I suppose has been brought to light even more so in recent months, is that when we're looking towards kind of achieving any form of success, as you've both said throughout, there's no one size fits all. There's no one thing that someone can do that everyone can do. There's so much to consider. There's so much balancing to sort of strike. So rather than say, well, what's the key to success, but looking at kind of what we've talked about, looking at the kind of digital readiness based on the report, based on just your understanding of where we are, from a retail supply chain perspective, what's one thing that you would say that's not necessarily a guarantee of success, but it would help steer people along the right path, whatever that path may be? What advice would you give? So
mine's straightforward. It's actually go to the website and do the digital readiness assessment with your team and actually use it as a conversation to actually think about how it may inform your strategy over the next 5 years.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the other thing I would just say to that is start. 5 years isn't that long away, and people can, you just have to assess what you're doing and start the process as soon as possible.
And then final question is a nice easy one then. You say obviously go to the website, find the report. Where's the best place that people can find out, access and learn more? Yeah,
so if they go to scdigitalreadiness.com, so SC for supply chain and digitalreadiness.com, they can log on, they can sign up. It's free. It's kind of anonymous. We don't share it. But if people want follow-up information from either Blue Yonder or from the University of Warwick, then we can kind of help support people kind of really making this transformation.
No, fantastic. Guys, thank you for joining me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Insight Podcast in association with the Interface.net and CPOstrategy.com. The Digital Insight is brought to you by B2E Media Limited. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please remember to subscribe, rate and review. And don't forget to check out our podcast archive at www.b2e-media.com/The Digital Insight.